The National Party is continuing to criticise the government over the cost of living crisis and is now calling for an independent review of the Reserve Bank's monetary policy. I'm joined by National's finance spokesperson and deputy leader, Nicola Willis.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Why are you so worried about what's happened in the past?
Well, what we know is that over the past 2 years, the Reserve Bank, together with the government, took unprecedented action in response to COVID-19. And the impact of that is pretty clear. We are living with the highest inflation in 32 years. We've been outside the target band for inflation for 15 months, and that looks set to continue. We've had massive and unsustainable house price inflation, and there are very real questions being asked by people about whether things could have been done differently. We believe those questions deserve further examination.
But on the other side, low unemployment, people stayed in jobs, the economy through that period did relatively well.
That's right. That's right, they did. And in fact, National absolutely supported the initial moves to have a stimulatory response. This is really about what lessons can we apply for the future. New Zealanders are now suffering from a terrible cost of living crisis. Those costs are impacting people across the community. And we think it's appropriate to look back and say, well, did we get all those judgments right as a country? Was the balance of monetary and fiscal policy correct? Were there things that, if they'd been done differently, would have meant that we weren't suffering the extent of the cost of living crisis today? Because if there are those lessons, we owe it to New Zealanders to apply them in future.
Well, with hindsight, it's obviously pretty clear that monetary policy didn't have to be as loose as it was. I'm just wondering, the immediate future now, do you have concerns that the bank might go the other way and actually tighten too much?
Well, to take your first point, in terms of the view that the bank has been too loose, well, let's have that inquiry and have that information on the table and be clear about how we'd prevent that happening again. When we look to the future, one of the key things that is going to happen is that in March, the Reserve Bank Board must make their recommendation to the Minister of Finance about whether or not to reappoint Adrian Orr or whether to nominate someone else. It's our view that as part of that process, the Reserve Bank Board should undertake an independent assessment of performance to date. And that should be brought to bear on the decision making.
But those decisions have been made by the Monetary Policy Committee, the ones that you're going to be looking at. Are you, though, putting all of the responsibility on Adrian Orr as Governor?
I acknowledge the role of the Monetary Policy Committee. Obviously, the Governor has a very important leadership role across a range of functions for the Reserve Bank, and the performance in that leadership role should, we believe, be independently assessed as part of the appointment process, just like every other chief executive in the country.
That's an implicit criticism of him. Would you remove him not reappoint him as Governor?
Well, we've been very clear. We think that there should be an independent assessment of the performance that he has provided. We support absolutely the independence of the Reserve Bank and the independence of its decision making, but that shouldn't stop us from assessing its performance, from questioning its performance, and frankly, for speaking on behalf of the New Zealanders who are so impacted by its decisions. We have had incredibly high inflation outside the remit for the bank, and the consequence now is rapidly rising interest rates, which are going to affect many, many New Zealanders, and we think it's right to examine the decisions that led us here.
And again on that though, do you think the bank should be careful about how far it pushes interest rates up? And is there a risk that just as perhaps it loosened monetary policy too much, that it will tighten too much?
Well, one of the things we think is critically important, and we've been saying repeatedly, is that this is not just about the Reserve Bank responding to inflation. There is also a role for central government. And it's our view that if central government doesn't take enough steps, then the obvious result is that the central bank will have to lift interest rates higher than it otherwise would. And in fact, that's a view that Treasury concurs with. That's why it's critically important that the government does its bit, reduce those bottlenecks for productive growth, such as labour force shortages, stop adding costs to business, be disciplined about its own spending. All of those things will help, and in the absence of those things, then we do worry that the pressure on interest rates will be higher than it would otherwise have to be.
I mean, across the Tasman, Ross Gittins, the economics editor for the Sydney Morning Herald, has written there about the Reserve Bank of Australia should be very careful not to push interest rates too high. And he argues because in the end, wherever he set interest rates isn't going to have a big impact on some of those drivers of inflation which come from offshore, such as supply chain issues, the impact of the war in Ukraine. I mean, again, do you have those concerns that there might be an overreach in response to those?
Well, National endorses the economic consensus of the past 30 years in which our monetary policy framework acknowledges that low, stable inflation is critical to the growth of a productive economy, and that in the absence of low, stable inflation, we will see vulnerable people very badly affected. We will see New Zealanders finding that their incomes are falling behind their prices. So we absolutely commit to the inflation goal, and the orthodox response to high inflation, which has always been lifting interest rates. I do want to acknowledge, however, the view that these issues are somehow coming simply from the Ukraine. In fact, analysis published earlier this week, authored by Graham Wheeler, argues that no, these impacts are not just about Ukraine and supply chain difficulties, they're actually about the extent of monetary stimulus that central banks around the world injected over the past few years. And that's, again, why we think examination of those decisions is warranted.
Obviously, did you know that report was coming out, given you timed the release of your statement on the independent review?
Yes, we did.
Yep.
We were provided an embargoed copy.
Okay. And on the basis of what the government can do, I think this week in Parliament, Christopher Luxon has said you've got a list of spending cuts or wasteful spending. What's your total? How much could you take out of government spending to take inflationary pressure off the economy?
Well, the most black and white evidence I can give you is to look at the budget that's just been passed and identify those things that we wouldn't have funded. We wouldn't be funding the $3 billion Three Water reform package and the huge incentive payments in there for councils, which are intended to try and convince them to support a policy they don't support and that communities don't support. We wouldn't have put $200 million in for a business case for light rail. We wouldn't have put hundreds of millions of dollars in for health restructuring at a time when the health system is under major pressure. We wouldn't have put $370 million in for a merger of RNZ and TVNZ that we don't think is necessary or required. We wouldn't have put the more than $150 million in to communicate changes to the Resource Management Act when that bill hasn't even been passed yet. And we wouldn't have been nearly so free with the chequebook in saying yes to big capacity adjustments for government departments, tens of millions of dollars in additional funding for policy advice, administration, communications advice. We don't think this is the time for expansion in those functions of government.
Do you have any idea of how much you could trim off inflation with taking those sorts of steps? I mean, how much pressure would it take off inflation?
Well, the Treasury have provided the Minister of Finance advice about that. And their advice is that the impact that you can have is about the reduction in interest rates that could occur if you were to reduce spending by a certain amount. Now, we are very conscious that when we come to present our fiscal plan next year, it is highly probable that the economic, fiscal and monetary conditions will be different from those that we have in front of us today. The commitment we have made is very clear. We will have disciplined government spending. We want to get more value out of the existing expenditure that's already occurring across public services. We do believe there is a strong case for tax reduction as a matter of fairness, because revenue from tax has grown so much for the Crown as inflation has pushed things up, and we believe the balance needs to be struck and New Zealanders should get more. And we also think it's very important that the Crown, where it can, be working alongside the Reserve Bank and not against it.
I mean, just go back to the three water reforms, for instance, and the money spent there, which you wouldn't spend. But do you accept that you'd end up having to invest more in upgrading the pipes under the ground for those three water services?
Oh, look, I absolutely accept that we need to do better on our management of the three waters, of stormwater, wastewater, freshwater. But I think it's really important that we come to a solution that includes communities, includes councils, assures them that their ownership interests and their voices continue to be heard. They're not satisfied that the four-entity megastructure provides that. And in the absence of that support and community buy-in, I think it's frankly reckless to be spending $3 billion on that particular solution. It's possible to both think that the status quo isn't good enough and to also think the solution proffered by the government isn't the right one.
Nicola Willis, thank you for your time.